Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, the fantasy writer's kit bag. This week I'm suffering from a bit of a head cold. I've got lots of snot in my nose and a very, very dry throat, so I'm going to keep it quite short this week. And I'm going to just discuss two topics. The first is wizards. So during Halloween week, one of the guys that I follow on Twitter asked her followers to share their favourite wizard. And you probably saw similar type tweets yourself during the Halloween week. Anyway, Gandalf came up a few times, but on the whole, most of the characters on the list, and there were hundreds of replies by the way, were of witches. So I was thinking to myself, I was going to tweet in about it, but then I thought I'll do a piece on myth and magic instead. But I was thinking to myself, what's the difference between a witch and a wizard? In the famous 1960s TV show called Bewitched, I always remember that male witches were described as warlocks. And I wondered why the programme makers didn't describe them as wizards. And before you write in to remind me that Hogwarts is a school for witchcraft and wizardry, let me give you one good definition of what I think a wizard is. And this definition actually comes from Tolkien, who was talking about Gandalf, who, if you remember, was a member of the Istari, or also known as the Wise Ones. So here's the definition that he uses, and it's the definition I use. A wizard is a wandering being who resembles a human man, possesses far greater physical and mental power. A wizard is a wandering being who resembles a human, but possesses far greater physical and mental power. Now, ask yourself this, do Harry Potter and his friends have greater physical and mental powers? I would suggest not. I think that they are just ordinary school kids who are learning their potions and their various different tricks as they go along. Are they men, or are they wandering beings who resemble humans? Anyway, Merlin of Arthurian legend is probably the first wizard to be mentioned in English poetry, and therefore could be described as the first wizard. But I'm going to suggest something even more mind-boggling than that. I'm going to suggest that Merlin is the one and only true wizard, and I'll come to that in a moment. So let's talk about Merlin. Merlin, which was originally Myrdin, Brittonic language, kind of like the Welsh, was first mentioned as early as 573 in writings, and he was known to be a Welsh bard, so a person who actually wrote and quoted poetry, and he's said to have lived in a forest like a wild man with the animals and had been blessed with the gift of prophecy. Merlin was mentioned in the Annals of Wales, which is a primary source material of the history of King Arthur. And it's important at this point to underline the fact that Merlin and Arthur existed long before the medieval period that we often associate with Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. These early tales are Roman or even pre-Roman in origin, so our notions, probably given to us by the way by Hollywood over the years, our notions of knights in shining armour and damsels locked away in towers is something which is completely anachronous. It comes from a period in history which is more like around about Henry VIII's time, whereas the real Merlin lived in 573, if not earlier. Our notions of knights in shining armour and damsels locked away in towers come from Hollywood, but also from Tennyson's writings, which I'll turn to later. Anyway, Merlin and Merlin's legend closely resembles that of a North British figure called Llael Ochan. And Llael Ochan appears in Jocelyn of Furness's 12th century Life of Kentigern, and this is an important founder of the post-Roman church in Strathclyde. Strathclyde was a kingdom up in Scotland. Incidentally, if you wanted to find out more about the difference between a duchy and a county and a shire and a kingdom, you need to listen to one of my previous Myth and Magics. Anyway, Llael Ochan was said to have been a wild man who lived in the Caledonian forest in this ancient kingdom, in the kingdom of Strathclyde. And there have been later claims that Llael Ochan was also known as Merlinium. Is that a coincidence, or is it the same person? And there's a famous poem titled The Conversation of Merlin and his twin sister Gwyneth, in which she refers to Merlin by the pet name Llywelyn. Do you not think that sounds a little bit like Llael Ochan? In Welsh, by the way, Llywelyn means brother, friend, and curiously, it means twin-like. A 9th century Welsh monk named Nennius wrote a history of Britain in about the year 828. And this was the first source to mention a military leader named Arthur, and academics point out that this is probably the only historical basis for the person that we call King Arthur, although Nennius describes Arthur as a captain or a military leader, a kind of a war chieftain. Anyway, his history, Nennius's history, does include reference to a wizard. But the more modern depiction of a Merlin that we recognise now, a Merlin that we recognise as a great wizard, comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth and his book Prophetiae Merlini, which was very much inspired by the history of the Britons by Nennius. This tended to be a collection of the prophecies made by the Welsh figure Merlin, whom Geoffrey of Monmouth called Merlin. Like the history by the monk Nennius, this was written in Latin, though the book became published, and I use scare quotes around that, because obviously in those days they would have to write it out by hand, but it became published around 1130. Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was born himself around the year 1090, claims that he got most of the information from ancient Brittonic tales, as some of these were passed down by word of mouth, but also from accounts that were written down by monks. One story of Merlin's prophetic talents tells of the tale of how a king asked the wizard to interpret the meaning of a vision that he'd had. The vision was that 2 dragons fought, one red and one white. Merlin explained that the red dragon was the British race, and the white dragon was the Saxons. The Saxons would win, and this was an accurate prophecy. It's not known why Geoffrey changed the spelling of Merlin to Merlin, but it's possible that as a French-speaking Norman, Geoffrey didn't like the word Merlin because he thought it was a bit vulgar. And if you know what the French word merde means, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If you don't know what merde, M-E-R-D-E, means, then I'll leave you to look it up. Anyway, tales such as Colwch and Olwen and The Dream of Gronnobi, its Welsh pronunciation, are the earliest prose stories of literature in Britain. These stories were compiled in Middle English in about the 12th to the 13th centuries, and they come from earlier oral traditions and have interested scholars since they seem to preserve older traditions of King Arthur. And these works are the works that inspired later writers. But it's really Sir Thomas Malory's late 15th century prose called the Morte d'Arthur. He was a French writer, but he was a British person, that brings us the glamour and adventure we normally associate with the Arthurian legends and the highly dramatised account of the wizard Merlin. Merlin is portrayed as a character who begins as a wild man of the forest, like Merlin in much older texts, and then he ends up advising Uther Pendragon, who's King Arthur's father, and eventually becomes the prophet of the Holy Grail, and later becomes tragically fascinated by the mysterious Lady of the Lake, who I'll probably talk about on another episode coming up. And the Lady of the Lake, if you didn't know this already, entombs him forever inside the trunk of a hawthorn tree. All of these ideas, the link with Uther Pendragon, the Holy Grail and the Lady of the Lake, all come from Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century prose. Now, it's not known how much Sir Thomas Malory's work influenced the French astrologer, physician and wandering clairvoyant Nostradamus. He was a man of science and religion, we know that, although he did dabble in horoscopes, necromancy, scrying and good luck charms. In fact, Nostradamus used a hawthorn rod as a wand. Did he get that idea from the entombment of Merlin inside the trunk of a hawthorn tree? Anyway, he's famous, as you know, Nostradamus is famous for his long-term predictions, and you've no doubt heard of his famous almanac. Nostradamus was very much influenced by Chaldean and Assyrian magic, which went back hundreds of years, in fact back to the very earliest civilizations. And if you met him ever, you'd have described him as a wizard, inasmuch as he wore a black cloak, a black hat, he had a long white beard, long white hair, and in addition to his almanacs, which we've heard of, he also published books on potions. And I'll ask you this, is he another embodiment of Merlin? A little after Nostradamus, the 16th century advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, known as John Dee, and you may well have heard of him too, was also a wandering philosopher and an alchemist and a spy master and one of the Queen's favourite advisors. Of Welsh descent, his family claimed to come from Welsh royal blood. Is this a coincidence? When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, Dee became her most trusted advisor on astrological and scientific matters. And in fact, he chose Elizabeth I's coronation date. Dee is known to have attempted to contact the spirit world using a scryer, or a crystal gazer, and he took great interest in the tales of Merlin, and he used Arthurian legend to help promote an enlarging British Empire abroad. As he became more involved in occult practices, he drifted further from the church and science, and it's understood that he considered himself able to communicate with angels. He was happy to claim that he was a new Merlin. Is he the same Merlin? Is he another embodiment of Merlin? A contemporary of John Dee is Sir Edward Kelley, who was also able to summon up spirits or angels in a showstone or a magic mirror. And this bloke, Sir Edward Kelley, allegedly knew the secret of the Philosopher's Stone. So I imagine the history of Sir Edward Kelley certainly had an influence on J.K. Rowling. Anyway, I've added an engraving of Sir Edward Kelley into the show notes because I wanted you to see that this guy, just like Nostradamus before him and his contemporary John Dee, was very much a wizard in the Merlin traditional mould. These blokes had long hair, long white beards, black hats, black cloaks. They held wands of hawthorn. Both these wizards, Dee and Kelley, seem to have based many of their ideas on the works of the German alchemist, astrologer and magician known in English as John Faustus. We often say Faust. Many of Faust's magical tales were sold and rehashed in what was known at the time as chapbooks, chapbooks, in the 16th century. Chapbooks were kind of the first ever penny dreadfuls. They were a type of cheap street literature printed for the consumption of ordinary folk. They're only 6 or 8 or even 10 pages long, tiny paper-covered booklets, and they were very popular. And Faust's various different adventures and exploits were printed in these. Nevertheless, Dee and Kelley were both influenced by Dr. Faust, possibly through these penny dreadfuls, and Faust lived in Bavaria in around 1480, so quite a while way before them. And he was described as a philosopher, an alchemist, and a magician and an astrologer. In fact, he died in an explosion after an alchemical experiment went wrong. That was in about 1541. There are several grimoires or magical texts attributed to Dr. Faust, and presumably some of these spellbooks were owned by Dr. Dee and Kelley. So was Faust also a Merlin figure. The Tudor playwright Christopher Marlowe, who was a contemporary of D. and Kelley, portrayed Dr. Faust as the archetypal adept of Renaissance magic in his quite famous The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus from about 1590. A 1620 woodcut of Dr. Faustus shows him to resemble, once again, the customary wizard, book in one hand, long staff in the other, no doubt made of hawthorn, standing inside a protective circle, wearing a magician's hat, a fur-trimmed cloak, and a long white beard and white hair. Another Merlin character. Much later, after Dr. D and Kelley, much later in history, an English poet named Alfred Lord Tennyson, 1809 to 1892, who was the poet laureate from 1850, retold the stories of King Arthur and the tales of his fatal love for Guinevere and the stories of the Knights of the Round Table. His 12 cyclical poems that make up the Idylls of the King were published between 1859 and 1885, and it's very much a mid-Victorian read. It's something that I liked very much when I was a young lad, aged about 14. I collected all of the Tennyson Arthur stories. Arthur himself tends to become the embodiment of what you might think of as the ideal Victorian male hero, a kind of Prince Albert type figure who was a father of the nation and a worthy person, not necessarily vain, not necessarily over-heroic, just a sensible, level-headed type character. And Lord Tennyson's poems contain explicit references to Gothic interiors, romantic appreciations of nature, society's growing anxiety about the changing gender roles. The poems also tell of Merlin and the Lady of the Lake, and most likely these ideas were first read by Tennyson in Sir Thomas Malory's Morte Arthur, and a lot of our ideas about what a medieval King Arthur looked like and acted like, living in a castle with knights in shining armour and going around hunting for the golden chalice and that sort of thing, comes from this mid-Victorian idea which was promoted by Lord Tennyson. In this figure, in Lord Tennyson's figure, the eternal body of Merlin, and perhaps even the fictional character image of Gandalf, is first conjured up. And I would like you to consider this, and I'm going to come to the conclusion now. I would like you to consider this. Is Merlin, is Gandalf, perhaps even is Obi-Wan Kenobi and Doctor Who, and almost certainly Albus Dumbledore, who apparently knows pretty much everything, are all these figures the same person? Because they're all eccentric wanderers, aren't they? They're all learned beings. They resemble human men, but they seem to possess far greater physical and mental powers. All of those ones I just mentioned are alchemists, philosophers, and wise prophets. My suggestion is they are all reincarnations, either in imaginary reincarnations or real reincarnations of the once and future Merlin. So before I leave you today and go back to bed, hopefully sucking on some honey lozenge to try to get my voice working again, I just wanted to quickly tell you about a bit of news that I came across during the week called the Staffordshire Hoard, Hoard. The Staffordshire Hoard is a huge quantity of golden artefacts that were discovered by a treasure hunter named Terry Herbert on the 5th of July 2009, when he searched an area of ploughed farmland near Hammerwich in Staffordshire in England with a metal detector. So this is quite recent that he found this quantity of golden artefacts. A major project to clean, investigate and research into the Staffordshire Hoard objects was completed this week, which is why it's in the news. And the research project has revealed many new insights into Anglo-Saxon Britain in about the 6th century. This is the largest Saxon hoard ever found. You may be familiar with the Sutton Hoo objects. Well, this is much larger. It contains 3,500 items, and that includes 86 sword pommels. So the sword pommel is the big lumpy bit at the end of the sword, which stops the sword slipping out of your fingers when you're wielding it. The hoard was hidden in a remote area, a little way south of the Roman Watling Street, and nearby the Roman military staging post of Leto Cetum. This was in a highland area that became the border between two Anglo-Saxon clans and the ancient kingdom of Mercia, and I've talked about the ancient kingdom of Mercia before. In a future episode I'll talk about the Roman streets. Anyway, apart from the three religious objects, which I'll turn to in a moment, the items in the hoard are of military nature, and they include many finely worked silver and gold sword decorations that were removed from weaponry, and these include 66 gold sword hilts and many hilt plates, some with beautiful inlays. In all, like I said, 86 sword pommels were found, and this constitutes the largest ever discovery of pommels in Britain. I said that there were some religious artefacts. There were 3 altar or processional crosses buried along with the military equipment, and this suggests that the people who owned these artefacts were Christian, although there's a counter-argument that the reason they were buried is because they weren't Christian. But I turn your attention to an interesting gold strip that was also found, and it's a gold strip which is inscribed with a biblical quotation from Numbers 10:35. Numbers is a book in the Bible. Numbers 10:35 was written in Latin on this golden strip, and it says, and I'm translating it into English for you, "Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them hate thee, flee before thee." This passage is quoted often, and notably in the life of the Mercian saint Guthlac, Guthlac. Guthlac of Crowland was a wizardly-like character who lived in a cave, and he talked to angels, and he famously fought off a bunch of demons who attacked him once in his cave. And he fought off the demons by quoting the above text. From then onwards, this text from Numbers 10:35 was thought to have magical qualities, and it was obviously especially useful for driving away demons. And it's thought that the gold strip that was found in this Staffordshire Hoard may have originally been fastened either to a shield or a sword belt to offer some protection to the owner. Now, doesn't this remind you a bit of Peter Brett's fantasy novel The Painted Man in the Demon Cycle? Anyway, it struck me when I read about this historical news that there are at least 2 things that might be of interest to fantasy writers, and I wanted to discuss them now. The first thing I thought was that almost all of these artefacts that were found were gold. I didn't even know that you could make gold swords, but I looked into it and I found out that gold swords was a thing at the time. I knew that they made bronze swords before, but why were the swords gold? And why decorate your swords so lavishly? Why decorate them with gold leaf? Well, I suppose it was to make the weapons more magnificent and to sort of show them off. But who are you trying to impress? Are you trying to impress the enemy? Because if so, you're much more likely that they will attack you to take away your gold. So is that why you had to bury the swords? Of course, there's another possible explanation, and it's this. Gold is naturally antibacterial. The oligodynamic effect of gold, or the oligodynamic effect of gold, has been known for centuries and was first properly discussed as a scientific theory by the ancient Greeks. What that means is that gold has the effect of being a disinfectant and a natural antibacterial, and it's why, by the way, it's used in dental fillings, and it's also why it's used in holy chalices. So if you are a Catholic person and you take Mass, you'll drink from a chalice, you'll find that the chalice is virtually always either gold gilt or silver gilt. And the reason for that is because those metals have antibacterial properties. Now, it's possible that the Anglo-Saxons used gold on their weapons for exactly that reason, to prevent infection. And of course, if you want to use this in your fantasy fiction, you might want to suggest that the only way you can slay a demon is by using a gold sword. How about that for an idea? So you use numbers 1035 to protect yourself from demons, but if you want to kill a demon, you must use a gold sword. And that brings me to point 2. Why bury the gold? Perhaps the Anglo-Saxon army was on the run, perhaps after a retreat, and the gold was weighing them down, and it seemed a good idea at the time to bury the weapons. But surely that would be madness to deposit your weapons. If anything, you would need your weapons even more crucially if you were being harried by a conquering army and you were on the retreat. So perhaps the Anglo-Saxon army was forced to surrender, and their enemy took these weapons off them and had them decommissioned by burying them in the ground. We know for a fact that when you decommission modern armies these days, you take away all their weapons and either set them on fire or bury them. But these weapons are a bit different to modern day rifles. These weapons were made of gold. So why didn't somebody come back later and take away the gold? That doesn't make sense either. It's a bit of a mystery, but I'm coming around to this idea. They must have been secretly hidden. They must have been secretly hidden when they were buried and then lost forever. And that's why they weren't found until a few years ago. And I've been thinking, is this the origin of the aetiological myth? And by the way, if you want to know what an aetiological myth is, you need to listen to episode 2 of Myth and Magic. Is this the origin myth of the dragon's gold? In the old English epic poem Beowulf, a slave steals a cup from a hoard of a sleeping dragon, and he causes the dragon to wake, and the dragon goes on a rampage of destruction. British dragons, and there's many types of dragon, which I'll cover on a later episode, but British dragons are generally depicted as living in rivers or having underground lairs or living in caverns, like the dragon in The Hobbit. And in these dark places, they jealously guard their gold hoards. Now, it seems to me that Mr. Terry Herbert, just a few years ago, discovered one of these dragon hoards. He found a massive amount of gold treasure that folk had been searching for and talking about for centuries and centuries. It proves that the dragon hoards exist, even if it doesn't prove that dragons exist. If you want to find out more about this, go to www.staffordshire.org.uk. The Staffordshire Hoard.